Section 31 of Manners, Customs, and Dress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Manners, Customs, and Dress during the Middle Ages and during the Renaissance period by Paul Lacroix. Section 31. Gipsies, Tramps, Beggars, and Cours de Miracle. There was another cause which greatly contributed to diminish the power as well as the prestige of this eccentric sovereign, and this was that the cut-purses, the night prowlers, and wood-thieves, not finding sufficient means of livelihood in their own department, and seeing that the argotiers, on the contrary, were always in a more luxurious position, tried to amalgamate robbery with mendacity, which raised an outcry amongst these sections of their community. The archisuppôts and the cajous at first declined such an alliance, but eventually they were obliged to admit all, with the exception of the wood-thieves, who were altogether excluded. In the 17th century, therefore, in order to become a thorough argotier, it was necessary not only to solicit alms, like any mere beggar, but also to possess the dexterity of the cut-purse and the thief. These arts were to be learned in the places which served as the habitual rendezvous of the very dregs of society, and which were generally known as the Cours de Miracle. These houses, or rather resorts, had been so called, if we are to believe a writer of the early part of the 17th century, because rogues and others, who have all day been cripples, maimed, dropsical, and beset with every sort of bodily ailment, come home at night, carrying under their arms a sirloin of beef, a joint of veal, or a leg of mutton, not forgetting to hang a bottle of wine to their belt, and, on entering the court, they throw aside their crutches, resume their healthy and lusty appearance, and, in imitation of the ancient bacchanalian revelries, dance all kinds of dances with their trophies in their hands, whilst the host is preparing their suppers. Can there be a greater miracle than is to be seen in this court, where the maimed walk upright? In Paris there were several Cours de Miracle, but the most celebrated was that which, from the time of Sauval, the singular historian of the antiquities of Paris, to the middle of the 17th century, preserved this generic name par excellence, and which exists to this day. He says, "It is a place of considerable size, and is in an unhealthy, muddy, and irregular blind alley. Formerly it was situated on the outskirts of Paris. Now it is in one of the worst-built, dirtiest, and most out-of-the-way quarters of the town, between the Rue Montorgueil, the Convent of Fille-Dieu, and the Rue Neuve Saint-Sauveur. To get there, one must wander through narrow, close and by-streets, and in order to enter it, one must descend a somewhat winding and rugged declivity. In this place I found a mud-house, half-buried, very shaky from old age and rottenness, and only 8 meters square, but in which nevertheless some 50 families are living, who have the charge of a large number of children, many of whom are stolen or illegitimate. I was assured that upwards of 500 large families occupy that and other houses adjoining. Large as this court is, it was formerly even bigger. Here, without any care of the future, every one enjoys the present, and eats in the evening what he has earned during the day with so much trouble, and often with so many blows. For it is one of the fundamental rules of the Cours de Miracle never to lay by anything for the morrow. Every one who lives there indulges in the utmost licentiousness. Both religion and law are utterly ignored. It is true that outwardly they appear to acknowledge a God, for they have set up in a niche an image of God the Father, which they have stolen from some church, and before which they come daily to offer up certain prayers. But this is only because they superstitiously imagine that by this means they are released from the necessity of performing the duties of Christians to their pastor and their parish, and are even absolved from the sin of entering a church for the purpose of robbery and purse-cutting. Paris, the capital of the kingdom of rogues, was not the only town which possessed a Cours de Miracle, for we find here and there, especially at Lyon and Bordeaux, some traces of these privileged resorts of rogues and thieves, which then flourished under the sceptre of the Grand Saucer. Sauval states, on the testimony of people worthy of credit, that at Saint-Anne-d'Auray, the most holy place of pilgrimage in Brittany, under the superintendence of the order of the Reformed Carmelite friars, there was a large field called Rogues' Field. This was covered with mud huts, and here the Grand Saucer resorted annually on the principal solemn festivals, with his officers and subjects, in order to hold council of state, that is to say, in order to settle and arrange respecting robbery. At these state meetings, which were not always held at Saint-Anne-d'Auray, all the subjects of the Grand Saucer were present, and paid homage to their lord and master. Some came and paid him the tribute which was required of them by the statutes of the craft. Others rendered him an account of what they had done, and what they had earned during the year. When they had executed their work badly, he ordered them to be punished, either corporally or pecuniarily, according to the gravity of their offences. When he had not himself properly governed his people, he was dethroned, and a successor was appointed by acclamation. At these assemblies, as well as in the Cours de Miracle, French was not spoken, but a strange and artificial language was used called jargon, langue matoise, narquois, etc. This language, which is still in use under the name of argot, or slang, had for the most part been borrowed from the jargon or slang of the lower orders. To a considerable extent, according to the learned philologist of this mysterious language, M. Francisque Michel, it was composed of French words lengthened or abbreviated, of proverbial expressions, of words expressing the symbols of things instead of the things themselves, of terms either intentionally or unintentionally altered from their true meaning, and of words which resembled other words in sound, but which had not the same signification. Thus, for mouth they said pantière, from pain, bread, which they put into it. The arms were lions, binders. An ox was a cornon, horned. A purse, a fouille, or fouilleuse. A coq, a horloge, or timepiece. The legs, des quilles, ninepins. A sou, a rond, or round thing. The eyes, des luisants, sparklers, etc. In jargon, several words were also taken from the ancient language of the Gipsies, which testifies to the part which these vagabonds played in the formation of the Argotic community. For example, a shirt was called lime, a chambermaid limogère, sheets, limon, words all derived from the Gypsy word lima, a shirt. They called an écu a rousquin, or rougesme, from rougia, the common word for money. A rich man, roupin, a house, tourne, a knife, chorin, from drup, tourna, and chori, which in the Gypsy tongue mean respectively silver, castle, and knife. From what we have related about rogues and the Cours de Miracle, one might perhaps be tempted to suppose that France was especially privileged, but it was not so, for Italy was far worse in this respect. The rogues were called by the Italians Bianti or Ceretani, and were subdivided into more than 40 classes, the various characteristics of which have been described by a certain Raphael Frianoro. It is not necessary to state that the analogue of more than one of these classes is to be found in the short description we have given of the Argotic kingdom in France. We will therefore only mention those which were more especially Italian. It must not be forgotten that in the southern countries, where religious superstition was more marked than elsewhere, The numerous family of rogues had no difficulty in practising every description of imposture, inasmuch as they trusted to the various manifestations of religious feeling to effect their purposes. Thus the affrati, in order to obtain more alms and offerings, went about in the garb of monks and priests, even saying Mass, and pretending that it was the first time they had exercised their sacred office. So the morghigeri walked behind a donkey, carrying a bell and a lamp, with their string of beads in their hands, and asking how they were to pay for the bell, which they were always just going to buy. The felsi pretended that they were divinely inspired and endowed with the gift of second sight, and announced that there were hidden treasures in certain houses under the guardianship of evil spirits. They asserted that these treasures could not be discovered without danger, except by means of fastings and offerings, which they and their brethren could alone make, in consideration of which they entered into a bargain, and received a certain sum of money from the owners. The Akatosi deserve mention on account of the cleverness with which they contrived to assume the appearance of captives recently escaped from slavery, shaking the chains with which they said they had been bound, jabbering unintelligible words, telling heart-rending tales of their suffering and privations, and showing the mark of blows which they had received. They went on their knees, begging for money, that they might buy off their brethren or their friends, whom they said they had left in the hands of the Saracens or the Turks. We must mention also the alacrimanti, or weepers, who owed their name to the facility with which they possessed of shedding tears at will, and the testatori, who, pretending to be the seriously ill and about to die, extorted money from all those to whom they promised to leave their fortunes, though, of course, they had not a son to leave behind them. We must not forget the protobianti, master rogues, who made no scruple of exciting compassion from their own comrades, nor the vergognosi, who, notwithstanding their poverty, wished to be thought rich, and considered that assistance was due to them from the mere fact of their being noble. We must here conclude, for it would occupy too much time to go through the list of these Italian vagabonds. As for the German, Spanish, and English rogues, we may simply remark that no type exists among them which is not to be met with amongst the Argotiers of France or the Bianti of Italy. In giving a description, therefore, of the mendicity practised in these two countries during the Middle Ages, we are sure to be representing what it was in other parts of Europe. The history of regular robbers and highwaymen during this long period is more difficult to describe. It contains only disconnected anecdotes of a more or less interesting character. It is probable, moreover, that robbers did not always commit their depredations singly, and that they early understood the advantages of associating together. The Tafurs, or Halegrins, whom we notice as followers of Godfrey de Bouillon at the time of the Crusades, towards the end of the 11th century, were terribly bad characters, and are actually accused by contemporary writers of violating tombs and of living on human flesh. On this account they were looked upon with the utmost horror by the infidels, who dreaded more their savage ferocity than the valor of the Crusaders. The latter even, who had these hordes of Tafurs under their command, were not without considerable mistrust of them, and when, during their march through Hungary, under the protection of the cross, these miscreants committed depredations, Godfrey de Bouillon was obliged to ask pardon for them from the king of that country. An ancient poet has handed down to us a story in verse setting forth the exploits of Eustace the monk, who, after having thrown aside his frock, embraced the life of a robber, and only abandoned it to become Admiral of France under Philip Augustus. He was killed before Sandwich in 1217. We have satisfactory proof that as early as the 13th century sharpers were very expert masters of their trade, for the ingenious and amusing tricks of which they were guilty are quite equal to the most skilled of those now recorded in our police reports. In the two following centuries, the science of the pince and of the croc, pincers and hook, as it was then called, alone made progress, and Pathelin, a character in comedy and an incomparable type of craft and dishonesty, never lacked disciples any more than Villon did imitators. We know that this charming poet, who was at the same time a most expert thief, narrowly escaped hanging on 2 occasions. His contemporaries attributed to him a poem of 1200 verses entitled La Répue Franche, in which are described the methods in use among his companions for procuring wine, bread, meat, and fish, without having to pay for them. They form a series of interesting stories, the moral of which is to be gathered from the following lines. C'est bien dîner quand on échappe, sans désbourser pas un denier, et dire adieu en tavernier, en torchant son nez à la nappe. The meaning of this doggerel, which is somewhat broad, may be rendered, he dines well who escapes without paying a penny, and who bids farewell to the innkeeper by wiping his nose on the tablecloth. Side by side with this poem of Villon, we ought to cite one of a later period, La Légende de Maître Faifeu, versified by Charles Boudinier. This Faifeu was a kind of Villon of Anjou, who excelled in all kinds of rascality, and who might possibly have taught it even to the Gipsies themselves. The character of Panurge in the Pantagruel is no other than the type of Faifeu immortalized by the genius of Rabelais. We must also mention one of the pamphlets of Guillaume Boucher, written towards the end of the 16th century, which gives a very amusing account of thieves of every description, and also L'Histoire Générale de la Ronde, in which are related numerous wonderful tales of murders, robberies, and other atrocities, which made our admiring ancestors well acquainted with the heroes of the Grève and of Montfaucon. It must not be supposed that in those days the life of a robber who pursued his occupation with any degree of industry and skill was unattended with danger, for the most harmless cutpurses were hung without mercy whenever they were caught. The fear, however, of this fate did not prevent the enfants de la matte from performing wonders. Brantôme relates that King Charles IX had the curiosity to wish to know how the cutpurses performed their arts with so much skill and dexterity, and begged Captain La Chambre to introduce to him, on the occasion of a banquet and a ball, the cleverest cutpurses, given them full liberty to exhibit their skill. The captain went on to the Cours des Miracles, and fetched 10 of the most expert of these thieves, whom he presented to the king. Charles, after the dinner and the ball had taken place, wished to see all the plunder, and found that they had absolutely earned 3,000 écus, either in money from purses, or in precious stones, pearls, or other jewels. Some of the guests even lost their cloaks, at which the king thought he should die of laughter. The king allowed them to keep what they had thus earned at the expense of his guests, but he forbade them to continue this sort of life under penalty of being hung, and he had them enrolled in the army, in order to recompense them for their clever feats. We may safely assert that they made but indifferent soldiers. End of section 31.